In this video, we're going to learn how to use the temperature probe sensor. This is the 8th video in a series of 10 about sensors. For this video, you're going to need the JackBord Basic, a USB-C cable, a PC or Chromebook running the Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge browser. You're going to need 3 10 or 20 centimeter female-female jumper wires, 1 temperature probe, 1 M4 nut, 1 M4 bolt, and 1 M4 spanner. This is the temperature probe. So basically we start off with the main part, which is the sensor itself. And that's held inside this steel end cap. And the purpose of this is to protect the sensor. So if you're measuring the temperature of some liquid and so forth, you would immerse this end of the temperature probe into the liquid. Then we have the cable, and this is what lets us measure the temperature at a distance, because if you recall, the temperature sensor built into the JackBord Basic is actually built into the board itself, and so you can't use it to measure the water temperature because you'd have to submerge the entire JackBord into the water, which is not a good idea. Whereas because the temperature probe here is located at the end of about a 1 meter cable, we're able to measure the temperature of things like liquids or other inaccessible places and not have to worry about damaging anything. And then finally, the cable connects to a thing called a universal sensor interface, and that's this guy here. And what this does is it just makes it easy to connect sensors to the JackBord. For example, you've got the QR code, so you can scan that and then just be taken straight to the page for the particular sensor you're looking at. And down here are a number of pins. So connected to the cable is this USI, and you can see here it's a much bigger version. And so we have these 3 pins which are where you connect to the JackBord, and then the USI itself. And one thing to remember about the USI is, one, it has a hole in it so you can bolt it easily onto something like the JackBord, and that just means that you don't have to worry about how you're going to physically mount it. It has the TMT code of the sensor that it represents over here. So you just go to jb.works and you put in that TMT code and it will tell you all about the sensor that you've got. And you can do the same thing with this QR code. But the other thing about the USI is that it has protection in there. So for example, if you accidentally connect the power lines the wrong way around, you're not going to damage the sensor. So the USI is all about being a universal way of easily connecting things to the JackBord and the JackBord Basic. Now if we look even closer at the USI, you can see we've got 3 pins. So the first one of these 2 yellow pins, and the yellow tells you that these are 3 volt power supply pins. So these give the USI or the sensor its power. Next we have the green ground pins, and these provide the ground for the sensor. And finally we have the data pin, and what the data pin does is it lets the sensor send its readings to the JackBord Basic. Because if you remember from previous videos, you have the sensor, which is a detector, then you have some processing, and then you have the output. So this is the output here. After the processing, it gets converted into digital data, and that's what gets sent to the JackBord and the JackBord Basic. So to connect these pins, we're going to use jumper wires. Now if we just do a quick review of what jumper wires are, they're basically electrical wires with female DuPont connectors on either end, and they let you plug into the pins that are mounted on things like the USI and the JackBord Basic. And so essentially a jumper wire is a convenient way of making a connection in a circuit. Now remember earlier we said that the probe had a little sensor in it, and this is the sensor here. It's basically a very small IC with 3 legs, and these 3 legs correspond to the pins that we just looked at on the USI. And then inside the end here is an even smaller chip, which is probably about the size, actually no, probably about 1/3 the size of a grain of rice. And that is what contains, first of all, the sensor, but also all of the processing logic and so forth that converts the temperature into a value that the JackBord or the JackBord Basic can use. And that's all done by an integrated circuit, which senses the temperature, processes the raw readings, and then converts them into a form that the JackBord is able to use. Now, like all sensors, the temperature probe has limits as to what it can do. So the first limit is that it can only measure temperatures between -55 and plus 110 degrees Celsius. So what this means is you cannot expose it to any kind of flame or any temperature that's above 110 degrees Celsius. The metal end of the probe can be submerged in liquids, but you shouldn't really submerge the rest of the probe in the liquids. Cold liquids are not so bad, so if you're measuring extreme temperature, that's fine, but you shouldn't put it into boiling water. If you're going to measure high temperature liquids like boiling water, just put in the metal part of the probe. And don't expose the JackBord or JackBord Basic to extreme temperatures. So just because the temperature probe can measure -55 to plus 110 doesn't mean that the JackBord can survive that. So you need to be careful that you keep the JackBord dry and don't expose it to temperatures beyond about 5 degrees up to about 40 degrees. And also, if it is cold, just watch out for condensation on the JackBord circuit board. Now, of course, before we can use the temperature probe, we actually need to connect it to the JackBord Basic. And just as an overview, you can see that you've got the probe here. We have the M4 nut and bolt which are holding it to the JackBord Basic. And then these are the jumper wires that provide the power and also data for the temperature probe to the JackBord Basic. And then on this side we have a more detailed view. So this is the temperature probe, which is this part over here. And then this represents port D on the JackBord Basic, which is this one here. And so the 3-volt jumper wire comes over here, and then it goes to the 3-volt pin on the Basic. The ground pin from the sensor goes to the ground pin on port D of the Basic. And then finally the data pin goes from the data line on the sensor over to port pin D1 on the JackBord Basic. And just be careful, because these pins on this side are actually port C, are not port D. So this port is different to the A and B and C ports, AB ports, because on the AB ports there are 2 of each pin. So there are 2 A1s, 2 A2s, etc. But on port C and D, which is this guy here, you only have 1 each. Okay, so now we're going to start putting this together. So first of all, this is the temperature sensor here, and we want to bolt it onto port B. And the reason we're doing that is it just makes it easier to handle. So I'm going to take the M4 bolt and put it through the center hole on port B, and then use your finger here to hold it in place. And take the temperature probe. And notice I'm holding the bolt in from the bottom, and now I'm going to put the nut on. And then once you've got the nut hand tight, just tighten it up a bit. It doesn't need to be really tight, it just needs to be tight enough that this can't just move around by itself. So now we've got the temperature probe USI connected to the JackBord Basic. The next thing we need to do is the jumper wires. So we'll start off with the green ground jumper wire, and notice I haven't got the JackBord Basic plugged in either. So I'm going to connect it to the middle pin on the sensor, which is the green one, and I'm going to go to the ground pin on port D, right here. Okay. Then the next one I'm going to put in is the power, the 3 volts. So I'm going to go from the yellow pin on the sensor over here to the 3-volt pin on port D over here. And then finally I'm going to take my other jumper and go from the blue data pin on the sensor along to port pin D1 right here. So we've got our 3 connections. So we've got the ground pin, or the ground connection, which is the green wire, the 3-volt power connection, which is the yellow wire, and the data cable, which is the blue wire. And if you don't have red, green, and blue, red, yellow, and blue jumper wires and green ones, don't worry about it. The color of the jumper wire doesn't matter, just as long as the connection is correct. So now we've got the sensor connected to the JackBord Basic. We now need to get some readings from it. Let's take a minute and check your connections against these pictures. So this one here shows the jumper wires connecting to the temperature sensor itself. So you've got the 3-volt power, ground, and data. And then over here we've got the corresponding cables going into port D. So this is port D1, which is the blue data line. Then we've got the ground line, which goes to the green cable, which is for ground. and then the yellow jumper goes into the 3-volt pin on port D. And then this is just an overview picture. Check yours against these and make sure that they match. And again, remember, the color of the wires isn't important, it's where they go that matters. Before we can start using the temperature probe, we need to set it up. And this involves telling the JackBord Basic about it. And for that, we use the SW1ON command. And when we run it, the JackBord Basic will look for devices on a thing called a one-wire bus. We don't need to go into detail about this right now. But basically, the one-wire bus is just a way of connecting lots of different sensors onto the same couple of wires, or 3 wires. And so what happens is it finds the temperature sensor and tells us on channel 37. And from that point on, we can get readings from the sensor. So this step is about having the JackBord Basic detect the temperature probe so that we can then use it. So I'm here on the start page and we've got our temperature probe connected. So now we're going to run the S1WON command. And here we go. So we run it, and now the Basic is telling us that it's found the temperature probe and that it's on channel 37. So now the JackBord Basic knows that this probe exists, and we can get some readings from it. We can get readings from the sensor, again, using the GT or GET command. And so we've run that down here, and you can see that it's on channel 37. This is temperature probe number 1, and the temperature is 18.75. So you can use the GT command to get readings from the sensor, and the sensor is using channel number 37. Okay, I'm here on the command page, so let's go GT, and there we go. So the temperature is 18.94. You can see it's on channel 37. Okay, let's get some more. Go down here so we get another set. And then if I grab the temperature probe, we should be able to get a slight change. There we go. Then if I bring in this cup of water, this is kind of hot water. I go GT. So you can see the temperature is rising quite a bit. And also if I go to the live page, there you go. So you can see the temperature is increasing. So 29, 30, you can see the value here. So you might notice that it doesn't go up instantly, and that's because the temperature of the water has to penetrate the probe on the outside, get through to the sensor, which is a tiny little chip on the inside of that IC chip that we looked at earlier. So this is how you can get readings from the temperature sensor. I'll take it out, and it should start falling. And there you go. And now the readings are falling, but they fall quite slowly. So this is the temperature probe on the end of a 1 meter cable. So to summarize, the temperature probe lets you measure temperature at a distance. It can measure a temperature over a range from -55 to +110 degrees Celsius. And the sensor is located in a metal jacket on the end of a wire. And if you're going to measure liquids, then you only put the metal part into the liquid. Especially at high temperatures. If you're measuring a stream temperature, then you can submerge the entire end, and that's fine. You can use the temperature probe to measure things like the temperature of your refrigerator or your freezer, a temperature of grass, a temperature of a stream. There's all sorts of things that it can be useful for. The temperature probe itself is connected to the JackBord Basic via a USI or Universal Sensor Interface, and that just provides an easy way of attaching the temperature probe to the JackBord while protecting both of them against mistakes like connecting the wires around the wrong way. In the next video, we're going to use the temperature probe to make a gauge temperature meter. To get directly to the next video, simply visit jb.works and search the TMT code shown on your screen. For more information and to get help, visit jb.works.